And so what was your journey to go from the movie business to writing historical romance?
So there's another career in the middle, right? So I was an actress first. I then went to grad school and had another career, which I can't talk about because I'm still linked to it. And that career does not play, because Felicity Niven's not my real name. That career does not play nicely with writing steamy romance. So I can't talk about that. But that, but, but it had to do with COVID, my change, because like many people, I went, we're only here once. I just I'm not really enjoying what I'm doing. And there's some real problems with what I'm doing. Not that I'm doing anything unethical. It's just the way the whole thing is set up. The business is
Yeah.
set up. So what do I really want to do? And I knew I didn't want to go back to acting. And I thought about a lot of things. And one of the things I landed on was flow. And I thought, well, where do I get flow from? So this idea that you sit down and you look up and 9 hours have gone by because you're so absorbed in what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, where do I get flow? And I get flow in reading. And I've gotten flow in the past in writing. And I thought, I hadn't written anything seriously. I'd written a play, I'd written a bunch of screenplays that never went anywhere, but I loved doing that. So I said, well, let me think about writing. And I actually worked very hard for 6 months on 3 different books that are different genres, none historical romance. It was a middle grade mystery, cozy mystery for middle graders with recipes. And it was a YA, like Space Academy dystopian science fiction book. And it was a woman's literature book.
Mm-hmm.
And I had real times. And then my mom, who loves historical romance, handed me A Week to Be Wicked. And she said, I think you'll like this. And I read it and I went, I love this. This is exactly what I want to write. I want to write love stories with sex. I want to write period stuff. And there's a little in my first book, you can kind of see the influence because I write about a mathematician and a rake as opposed to a geologist
Mm-hmm.
or a paleontologist and a rake. And it wasn't that I read it and I thought I could do what Tessa Dare does, because I was like, I can't be that, I'm not going to be funny like that or brilliant like that. But I was like, I just felt like, oh, I can do that. My undergrad degree is in English literature. I wrote my thesis on Shakespeare. I read every Jane Austen book 5 times before I graduated from high school. I just am immersed in that. So I thought, I think I can do this. And that was it. And honest, and just terrible. I'm still extremely not well versed in historical romance. Spent the last 2 years reading as much as I can, but I think I'd only read about 20 or 30 historical romances before I wrote my first one. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. I'm curious, what do you think? Do you have a sense? It might be so id level that you can't access it, but do you have a sense of what it is that historical romance delivers that, like, a middle grade cozy mystery? Obviously, there are very different subject matters, but what about
Right.
the form made it the thing that makes you flow?
The guaranteed happily ever after
Mm,
is extremely important to me, and that's why maybe romance rather than women's literature, that
mhm.
I knew what I was going for. And that you're going to get this couple together. You're going to make these people fall in love. And this idea that was going to be my job is to create 2 people and get them to fall in love and to get them to heal each other, that they give each other the thing that they need. I was always loved history and historical fiction. And I think there's a lovely separation, which, since I was coming to this from COVID, gosh, I really wanted to separate myself from the modern world. And which is one of the reasons I went and did the science fiction. I was like, let me write about another universe's problems. And you know what was interesting? I think it was really to my advantage that I had not read a lot of historical romance, because those three other genres, I hadn't read a lot of middle grade mystery, but I'd read a lot of adult mystery, a lot of cozy mystery, a lot of women's literature, and a lot of science fiction. And when I went to write, I felt I was incredibly derivative. I did not have a voice.
Mm,
But because I'd read so little historical romance, when I started writing, as soon as I started writing my first book, I found my voice because I hadn't read enough to go, oh, I'm not as good as X, I'm not as good as Y, I'm not as,
right.
um, I didn't get into the comparisonitis, and I didn't feel like I was copying anybody, and I felt like that with the other genres. So
Yeah. Well, that's so
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, it's
Well,
strange. I don't advise it. I don't advise to start writing in a genre you don't know that much about, but it really worked for me. So yeah.
yeah. I also wasn't someone who'd been reading historical romance my whole life. I had read,
Hmm.
it had been my guilty pleasure for like maybe 3 or 5 years. So I had read a fair amount of it. But then I decided to try writing one and it was so freeing. And now I've been like, oh my gosh, there's a whole lot more to it that I hadn't read. Like I felt like I knew the players. And then as I
Hmm.
started joining Bookstagram, I was like, oh, no, I've only read one of that author's and I've never heard of that author. And like, there's so much, which is
Yeah.
lovely because you're never going to run out of something to read.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.